Cassian Moretti was a man who ruled through the cold arithmetic of fear. A single imperceptible nod from him was enough to extinguish a life before the sun went down. He was the King of Ash, presiding over an empire built on ironclad silence and the heavy weight of his name. But tonight, the throne was a world away. Clad in a tailored suit now stained by the dark reality of a narrow escape, Cassian sat alone in the flickering, dim light of a nameless diner, nursing a jagged wound and the bitter taste of betrayal. The city hummed with the hunt outside, but inside this hushed sanctuary of cracked vinyl and stale coffee, a different kind of violence reached him. It was a jagged, rhythmic sound drifting from behind the swinging kitchen door, a raw, broken sobbing that bypassed his predatory instincts and struck his heart. For the first time in a decade, the man who had everything stopped running to listen to a woman who had nothing, captivated by a sorrow more honest than any power he had ever known. The sound was a tether, pulling him out of the cold calculations of survival and into the humid, grease-slicked air of the kitchen. Cassian pushed through the swinging door. The hinges let out a low, rusty groan that went unnoticed by the woman at the prep table. Sade was a silhouette of quiet devastation, her frame hunched over a mountain of silver cutlery, her fingers moving with a mechanical, desperate rhythm, even as her breath hitched in her throat. She was trying to outrun her own grief with labor, her hair escaping its ponytail in damp strands that clung to her salt-stained cheeks. He stayed in the threshold, a dark, heavy presence that seemed to devour the flickering light of the overhead fluorescence. For a man whose life was measured in territories and body counts, the sight was jarringly intimate. He was used to people crying for mercy, for time, or for their lives. But Sade wasn't crying for an audience. She was weeping for the sheer, exhausting weight of being alive. The mask of the boss, that calcified layer of indifference he had worn like armor since he was a boy, began to fissure. He looked at his own hands, blood-smeared and lethal, and then at hers, red raw from dishwater and work. He could have reached into his pocket and thrown enough cash on the table to change her year, but he knew with a sudden, sharp clarity that money wasn't the currency she needed. Not yet. Cassian took a step forward, the soles of his expensive, blood-dusted shoes silent on the linoleum. He didn't stop until he was standing just behind her, close enough to smell the lemon scent of her detergent and the faint, sweet aroma of vanilla. Sade froze, her shoulders locking as she finally registered the shadow falling over her work. She didn't turn around. She was too used to being invisible. Too used to the world pressing down on her to expect anything but another burden. "Don't," he said. The word was a low vibration, devoid of the gravelly command he used to break men. It was a soft, singular note that hung in the air like a shield. Sade's hands stopped moving. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her head bowing lower, as if the simple sound of a human voice had finally given her permission to stop pretending. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, a gesture so vulnerable and tired, it made Cassian's chest ache with a sensation he couldn't name. "The shift, it's just been long. I'll have your check in a moment, sir." "Keep the check," Cassian replied, his voice steadier now, though the iron in his soul felt strangely molten. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, before he caught himself and pulled back into the safety of the dark. He was a monster, and monsters didn't comfort the broken. They just stood in the wreckage. But as he turned to leave, he felt the mask slip entirely, leaving behind a man who was no longer just hiding from an ambush, but searching for a way back to the light. Just breathe. The world isn't going to end tonight. He disappeared back into the diner's shadows before she could look him in the face, leaving her with nothing but the fading heat of his presence and the first honest breath she'd taken in weeks. The following night, the back booth was no longer a refuge from a hit squad. It had become a watchtower. Cassian returned when the city was at its quietest, shedding the blood-stained silk of the previous evening for a clean charcoal suit that still felt like a shroud. He sat in the same spot, ordered the same burnt coffee, and began the slow, deliberate process of learning the rhythm of a life he had never bothered to notice. Sade moved through the diner like a ghost, tending to the living. Cassian watched as she wiped down counters that were already clean, her movements efficient yet weary. He saw the invisible work, the way she anticipated the needs of a surly truck driver before he could snap his fingers, the way she surreptitiously refilled the water of a homeless man sitting in the corner without making him feel like a charity case. She was a master of the small, unnoticed gestures that kept a crumbling world from falling apart. And yet, to every soul that walked through the door, she was merely a fixture of the room. People looked through her as if she were made of glass. They barked orders while staring at their phones. They left crumpled bills and sticky messes without a second thought, treating her as a mechanical extension of the coffee pot. Cassian felt a cold, sharp spark of irritation ignite in his chest. He was the most feared man in the state, a phantom whose name silenced rooms, and he realized with a bitter irony that he was the only person in the building truly looking at her. He watched the way her brow furrowed when she checked the mounting stack of invoices by the register. He noticed the slight limp she tried to hide when the clock struck 4 a.m., and the way she tucked a stray, dark lock of hair behind her ear with a hand that never quite stopped trembling. She was a map of quiet scars and unvoiced burdens, and for the first time in his life, Cassian found himself uninterested in the broad strokes of power. He was captivated by the fine lines of her endurance. When she finally approached his booth, her eyes were wary, searching his face for the man who had spoken to her in the kitchen. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't have one to give. He simply watched her pour the coffee, the steam rising between them like a veil. "You're back," she said softly, her voice steadier than the night before, but still fragile. "The coffee's tolerable," Cassian lied, his gunmetal eyes never leaving hers. He paid with a $5 bill, the smallest currency he owned, and watched her fingers brush his as she took it. It was a mundane transaction, a $5 alibi to justify his presence in a world where he didn't belong. But as she moved away to serve another nameless customer, Cassian realized the lie was no longer for the police or his rivals. It was for himself. He was pretending to be a customer, pretending to be a man who just wanted a drink, so he could spend another hour being the only person who saw her as she truly was. She was the one holding the world together, and he was the only one who realized it was breaking her. The transformation of the diner began not with a grand gesture, but with the cold, surgical precision of a man who moved mountains in the dark. Cassian reclaimed his seat in the corner booth, a silent sentinel draped in shadows, watching as the world attempted to bruise Sade Ellison. He saw a local regular, a man whose breath reeked of cheap gin and entitlement, grab Sade's wrist when she wasn't fast enough with his refill. He saw the flash of fear in her eyes, the way she apologized for a bruise she didn't deserve. Cassian didn't move. He didn't cause a scene. He simply memorized the man's face, his license plate, and the way he sneered. By the following night, the man was gone, not dead, but possessed by a sudden, terrifying urge to never set foot on this side of the city again, driven by a conversation with two men in a dark sedan that had left him shaking and packed for a different state. Then came the bills. Cassian watched Sade at the small desk near the pantry, her head in her hands as she stared at a final notice for the diner's industrial refrigerator, a debt that threatened to pull the floor from under her. The next morning, a courier in a nondescript uniform walked in, handed her a receipt for a balance paid in full by an anonymous community trust, and left before she could find her voice. Sade moved through the aisles with a new, bewildered lightness. She began to look around the room, her gaze lingering on the empty spaces where her problems used to be. She felt a presence, a warmth that warded off the biting cold of her debt, yet she could never quite pin it down. When she walked to her car at 4 a.m., the streetlights that had been broken for months were suddenly glowing with a blinding, protective hum. The predatory shadows of the alleyways seemed to retreat whenever she passed, as if the darkness itself had been commanded to stand at attention. She began to call it her guardian angel, a whispered thought she shared only with the steam rising from her morning tea. She didn't notice that the man in the back booth always arrived just before the threats vanished and stayed until the sun provided its own security. Cassian watched her from behind his coffee, his expression unreadable, his heart a strange mixture of static and stone. He was fixing the plumbing, clearing the debts, and erasing the monsters, all while remaining the greatest monster of them all. He was becoming the ghost in her machine, a protector who asked for nothing but the sight of her shoulders finally uncrossing, and the small, tentative smile that began to return to her lips when she thought no one was looking. He was orchestrating a symphony of safety, proving that while he couldn't change his own past, he could at least ensure her future wasn't written in the same ink. The peace Cassian had meticulously built for Sade was shattered by the sound of a door being kicked open rather than pushed. Leo Vance didn't walk into a room, he invaded it. He was a man who smelled of expensive cigarettes and cheap souls, wearing a suit that cost more than the diner's monthly revenue, but lacked the quiet dignity of Cassian's own tailored armor. Vance was a vulture, a bottom feeder who thrived in the gray area between corporate law and street-level extortion. He represented the slow, suffocating death of the working class, the kind of man who didn't use a gun to ruin you, but a signature and a lean. Cassian felt the familiar cold tightening in his jaw as he watched Vance approach the counter. He recognized the stink immediately. It was the unmistakable aura of the underworld, a predatory arrogance that assumed every room belonged to the man with the most leverage. Vance wasn't just a local debt collector. He was a symptom of the very rot Cassian had spent his life managing. "Sade, darling," Vance drawled, his voice a slick oil spill that made the air feel heavy. He tossed a manila envelope onto the counter, sliding it through a puddle of spilled sugar. "The grace period has expired, and I must say, for someone living on borrowed time, you've been looking remarkably comfortable lately." Cassian watched Shade's reaction from the shadows of his booth. The guardian angel lightness he had worked so hard to cultivate vanished in an instant. Her shoulders didn't just hunch, they shook. The envelope was a death warrant for the diner, a legal loophole Vance had been widening for months. "I paid the arrears, Leo," Shade whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "Every cent. The trust handled it." Vance let out a dry, rattling laugh. "The trust? You think a few anonymous checks can stop a redevelopment contract? This block is being cleared, Shade. You're a footnote in a much larger ledger." He leaned in closer, his shadow stretching over her. "And unless you want to find out how quickly this place can burn before the insurance kicks in, you'll sign the surrender papers by dawn." The diner went unnaturally still. Cassian's hand tightened around his coffee cup until the porcelain groaned. He knew Vance. More importantly, he knew who Vance worked for. The Vulture was a small-time player for the Moretti family's rivals, a man laundering money through property seizures. In an instant, the wall Cassian had built between his violent throne and this quiet sanctuary crumbled. His two lives weren't just touching, they were colliding with the force of a high-speed wreck. Shade's gaze flickered toward the back booth, a silent, desperate plea for the man who had become her only constant. She didn't know he was a monster, she only knew he was there. Cassian looked back, his gunmetal eyes locking onto hers. For weeks, he had been a ghost, fixing her world with whispers and shadows. But as he watched Vance's hand reach out to mockingly pat Sade's cheek, Cassian realized the time for ghosts was over. To save the light, he would have to invite the darkness back into the room. The King of Ash was no longer just watching. He was deciding exactly how much of Leo Vance would be left to bury. The sky over the city finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the diner's windows into blurred sheets of gray. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and cooling iron. Then, with a sudden, violent crack of thunder, the world went black. The hum of the refrigerators died, the neon open sign flickered out, and the diner was plunged into a heavy, velvet darkness. Cassian didn't move. He sat in the silence, his senses heightening as he heard Shade's sharp intake of breath from across the room. A moment later, the small, amber glow of a lighter cut through the gloom, followed by the steady flame of a single emergency candle. She walked toward his booth, the candlelight dancing in her eyes, making her look like a saint carved out of shadows. "I think the universe wants us to stop for a minute," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She slid into the seat across from him, the first time she had ever dared to bridge the distance. In the intimate circle of light, the sharp edges of Cassian's world felt 1,000 miles away. For an hour they talked. Shade spoke not of debts or vultures, but of the dreams she had buried under layers of survival. She talked about wanting to go to the coast, to see a horizon that wasn't blocked by brick and steel, and to open a place where people didn't just eat, but felt safe. I used to think I could be someone, she murmured, looking at her hands. Now I just want to be somewhere quiet. Cassian listened, his heart a foreign weight in his chest. As she spoke, he realized with a staggering sense of loss that he had forgotten how to dream. His future was a series of tactical maneuvers. His sleep was a light, paranoid trance. He had traded his imagination for an empire, and in the glow of Shade's quiet hope, he realized he had been cheated in the bargain. You aren't just someone, Shade, he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. You're the only thing in this city that isn't for sale. She looked up, and the air between them shifted, becoming electric and heavy. The rain hammered against the roof, isolating them in a bubble of candlelight. Slowly, leaning into the pull of a gravity neither of them could fight, Cassian moved closer. He could smell the rain on her skin and the sweetness of her breath. He wanted to tell her his name, the real one. He wanted to tell her he was the one who had cleared her path. Their lips were inches apart, the heat of her skin calling to the frozen parts of his soul, when the silence was shattered. The shrill, vibrating buzz of his phone against the table felt like a gunshot. Cassian pulled back, the mask of the boss slamming back into place with a cold, metallic finality. He looked at the screen, an encrypted alert. The rival faction had made their move. The war he had been avoiding had arrived at his gates. I have to go, he said, his voice now devoid of the warmth he had discovered just moments before. He stood up, the shadow he cast swallowing the candle's light. Sade looked at him, confused and suddenly cold, as he walked toward the door, leaving her alone in the dark. He didn't look back. The man who had almost learned to dream was gone. The boss was back, and he had a city to burn. The morning after the storm felt more like an ending than a new beginning. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and the lingering chill of the power outage. Cassian returned to the diner at dawn, his eyes bloodshot, from a night spent orchestrating a counterstrike that had left 3 warehouses in ashes. He was Cass again, the quiet man in the charcoal suit, but the weight of the handgun tucked into his waistband felt heavier than ever. He found Sade at the counter, her frame seemingly smaller than it had been in the candlelight. Leo Vance was already there, leaning against the register with the casual cruelty of a man who knew he held the winning hand. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time. He simply tapped a gold-plated watch. 24 hours, Sade. Vance's voice was a jagged blade. The developer moved up the deadline. By this time tomorrow, I want the keys on this counter, or the bulldozers will start their work with you still inside. No more anonymous trusts. No more miracles. Just the cold, hard reality of the law. Vance spared a dismissive, mocking glance at Cassian, treating him like just another piece of the diner's outdated furniture, before sauntering out the door. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights. Then, the sound returned. The jagged, broken sobbing that had first drawn Cassian into her world. But this wasn't the quiet weeping of the kitchen. This was the sound of a spirit finally snapping. Sade collapsed onto a stool, her face buried in her apron, her breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. I can't do it anymore, she choked out, the words muffled by the fabric. I thought someone was helping. I thought I was safe. But it was just a dream, wasn't it? Cassian stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. He walked toward her, every instinct screaming at him to reach out, to pull her into the hollow of his chest and tell her that the world was hers. But he looked at his hands, hands that had ordered the burning of those warehouses only hours ago, and he stopped. Cass could offer her a shoulder to cry on. Cass could offer her the meager savings of a working man. But Cass was a lie, a fiction born of his own selfish desire to be human for a few hours a night. A lie couldn't stop a redevelopment contract. A lie couldn't stop Leo Vance. He looked at Sade, really looked at her, and saw the slow death Vance had promised already taking hold. She was fading before his eyes because she was playing by the rules of a world that was rigged against her. In that moment, the man known as Cass died in the corner of that diner. Cassian felt the familiar, icy resolve of the Moretti bloodline take hold. If the world was rigged, he would be the one to break the machine. If the law was being used as a weapon, he would bring a war. He realized with a terrifying clarity that while he had enjoyed the peace of being Cass, that man was useless here. Sade, he said, his voice no longer a low rumble, but the sharp, commanding tone of a king. She looked up, startled by the sudden shift in his energy. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with tears, but she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. The gentleness was gone, replaced by a cold, predatory focus that made the very air in the diner feel thin. "Go home," he commanded. "Lock your doors. Don't answer for anyone but me." "Why, Cass, what are you going to do?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, pulling his phone from his pocket. He wasn't calling a plumber or a courier this time. He was calling the men who dealt in silence and lead. "Vance is working for the Valenti family," Cassian said into the phone as he stepped out into the gray morning light. "I want his locations, I want his ledgers, and I want the Valenti frontman brought to me by midnight." He looked back through the window one last time. Sade was watching him, her hand pressed against the glass, looking at him as if he were a stranger. She was right. The man who had almost kissed her in the dark was gone. The boss had returned to his throne, and he was about to show the city why it was a mistake to touch anything that belonged to a Moretti. The final hour didn't arrive with a legal notice or a phone call. It arrived with the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots on linoleum. Leo Vance didn't come alone. He brought 3 men who lacked his expensive tailoring, but possessed twice his cruelty. Men who didn't move like collectors, but like wrecking crews. They didn't come to talk. They came to dismantle. Sade stood behind the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the formica. "You have until dawn, Leo. You gave me 24 hours. "I lied," Vance sneered, stepping over a chair his men had just overturned with a casual kick. He reached across the counter, his fingers snaking into the fabric of her apron, bunching the modest cotton to pull her forward until her face was inches from his. "I decided I didn't want to wait. The world belongs to those who take it, Sade. And right now, I'm taking this." When she tried to pull away, Vance's hand flew out in a sharp, stinging arc. The sound of the slap echoed like a gunshot in the small space, a violent punctuation mark that shattered the diner's lingering peace. Sade stumbled back, her hand flying to her burning cheek, her eyes wide with a shock that quickly curdled into a terrifying, hollow silence. In the back booth, the man known as Cass didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply stood up, and as he did, the air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The controlled concern that had defined his presence for weeks evaporated, replaced by a lethal aggression so dense it felt like a physical weight. "Take your hand off her," Cassian said. It wasn't a request. It was an execution order delivered in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. Vance laughed, turning toward the booth with an oily grin. "And who's going to make me? You? The guy who spends his nights nursing a $5 coffee and a wounded ego?" He nodded to his men. "Handle the spectator. Make it messy." The 2 thugs moved toward Cassian, but they never reached him. With a speed that defied his large frame, Cassian moved. He didn't fight like a man. He dismantled them like a machine. A shattered jaw, a collapsed knee, a throat crushed with surgical precision. In less than 5 seconds, both men were on the floor. The sound of breaking bone, the only music in the room. Cassian stepped over the wreckage, his gunmetal eyes locked on Vance. He reached up and slowly unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling back his sleeves to reveal the intricate, dark tattoos that snaked up his forearms and disappeared under his collar, the mark of the Moretti bloodline. Vance's face went ash-gray. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a primal, stuttering terror as he recognized the ink. He recognized the cold, dead stare that had launched 1,000 urban legends. "Moretti," Vance whispered, the name catching in his throat like a shard of glass. You're supposed to be dead. The Valentis said you were gone." "I was," Cassian said, his voice a low, terrifying hum as he closed the distance. "Until you touched what belongs to me." He grabbed Vance by the throat, lifting the smaller man off the ground with a single, massive hand. The violence that followed was brief and absolute, a flurry of motion that left Vance crumpled against the very counter he had tried to seize. Cassian didn't use a gun. He used his hands, showing the room exactly how he had earned his throne and why the city was afraid of the dark. Sade watched from the corner, her breath coming in shallow, terrified hitches. She looked at the blood spattered across her white apron, Vance's blood, and then at the man standing over the carnage. This wasn't Cass. This wasn't the guardian angel who fixed her plumbing. This was a king standing in a graveyard of his own making. Cassian turned toward her, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. For the first time, he didn't hide his eyes. He let her see the monster, the boss, the man who had burned half the city to keep her corner of it quiet. Sade didn't move toward him. She simply looked at the blood on her apron, the trust in her eyes replaced by a paralyzing, newfound fear. The scent of ozone and copper hung heavy in the air, a thick, cloying reminder of the man who had just been dismantled. Cassian stood amidst the wreckage of the booth, his chest rising and falling in a slow, predatory rhythm. The lethal heat of the confrontation was cooling into something much more dangerous. The truth. He looked down at his knuckles, split and stained, then back at Sade. She was pressed against the industrial refrigerator, her hands trembling so violently that the metal handle rattled against its frame. Her eyes weren't on the unconscious men on the floor. They were fixed on the ink, snaking up Cassian's neck, the crown of thorns and the serpent that marked him as the head of the Moretti Empire. The newspapers called him the ghost of the North End. The news anchors spoke his name in hushed, frightened tones whenever a warehouse burned or a rival vanished. "Sade," he said, taking a step toward her. His voice was no longer the soft, gravelly comfort of a regular. It was the voice that commanded an army of shadows. "Don't," she choked out. The word was a jagged glass shard. She looked at the blood on her white apron, the blood he had spilled to protect her, and recoiled as if it were acid. All this time, the bills getting paid, the men who stopped coming around, the lights on the street, it wasn't a miracle. It was you. "I was protecting you," Cassian replied, the Cass persona crumbling completely, leaving only the cold, hard edges of the boss. "Vance would have destroyed you. I did what was necessary." "You lied," she whispered, her voice cracking. She looked around her diner, her sanctuary, now stained with the visceral reality of his world. "I thought you were a good man who understood what it was like to struggle, but you're the reason people struggle. You're the monster they tell us to hide from." The rejection hit Cassian harder than any bullet ever had. He had spent weeks trying to peel off the mask of the monster, only to realize that the mask had become his skin. He had saved her diner, but in doing so, he had murdered the only version of himself that she could ever love. He saw the horror in her gaze, the way she looked at him not as a savior but as a predator who had been playing with its prey. "You need to leave," she said, her voice gaining a desperate, brittle strength. She pointed toward the door, her fingers shaking. "I don't want your protection. I don't want your money. I want you out of my sight." "Shad, the Valentis won't stop because Vance is down," he warned, his protective instincts clashing with the stinging reality of her fear. "Then let them come," she cried, the tears finally breaking through. "I'd rather lose this place than owe its life to a murderer. Get out, Cassian, before I forget that I ever had any right to trust the man I thought you were." Cassian stood frozen for a heartbeat, the silence of the diner weighing tons. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stack of bills for the coffee he'd never finished, and placed them on the counter. He didn't look at her again. He couldn't. He turned and walked out into the rain, his silhouette vanishing into the dark, leaving behind a woman who was finally safe, and a man who had never been more alone. The seasons changed with the cold indifference of the city, but inside the diner, the air felt different. 6 months had passed since the night the floors were stained with the reality of Cassian's world. The bullet holes in the walls had been patched, the neon sign hummed with a steady, reliable glow, and the greasy spoon was no longer a footnote in a developer's ledger. It was a landmark, funded by an anonymous endowment known only as the Legacy Foundation. The diner had become a sanctuary for the neighborhood, providing the safety and stability Shad had always dreamed of. Shad moved through the aisles with a confidence that hadn't been there before. The dark circles under her eyes had vanished, replaced by the quiet glow of a woman who was no longer looking over her shoulder. She still wore the modest apron, and her hair was still tied back in a simple ponytail, but she was the owner of her destiny now. She never asked where the money came from. Deep down, she knew, but she had used the gift to build something that didn't smell of blood or fear. The bell above the door chimed, a soft, familiar sound. It was the graveyard shift, the hour of ghosts and secrets. Shad didn't look up immediately as she wiped down the counter. "Sit anywhere you like, we're almost." The words died in her throat. A man stood in the doorway. He wasn't flanked by shadows or soldiers. He wasn't wearing the sharp, suffocating armor of a tailored black suit. He wore a simple linen shirt with the collar open, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos that no longer looked like threats, but like history. The boss was absent. His posture was no longer a challenge to the world, but a humble admission of his own humanity. Cassian took a slow, tentative step forward. He didn't cross the line into her space. He stayed by the same back booth where a monster had once learned to watch a saint. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that she was whole. He had spent months dismantling his empire, turning a kingdom of fear into a network of legitimate trusts, stripping away the Moretti until only the man remained. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, terrifying silence of the night he left. It was a question, hanging in the air like the scent of fresh rain. Shad gripped her cleaning rag, her heart hammering a rhythm of recognition and a lingering, fading hurt. She saw the change in the way he held himself, the vulnerability in his gunmetal eyes that he was no longer trying to hide. "It's a long way from the North End," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'm not in that world anymore," Cassian replied. His voice was rough, but it lacked the iron command of the past. He didn't offer her an apology she might not be ready to hear, and he didn't offer her a life she hadn't asked for. He didn't ask for her hand, her forgiveness, or a second chance at the kiss they had lost in the dark. He simply gestured to the empty seat in front of him. "I was wondering if I could just have a cup of coffee. I hear the owner runs a good place." Shade looked at him for a long beat, the memory of the guardian angel and the monster blurring into the man standing before her. Slowly, she picked up a clean mug and the glass pot. She walked to his booth, the same booth where it all began, and poured the coffee. The steam rose between them, a bridge made of heat and hope. She didn't turn away. Instead, she set the pot down and sat across from him, watching the man who had burned his world down just to make sure hers stayed bright. The King of Ash surrendered his throne for a seat at her table. By choosing to heal instead of hurt, Cassian proved that true power isn't found in a weapon, but in the courage to be human. Shade's life was changed not just by his protection, but by the man he became for her. How do you feel about Cassian's transformation? Could you forgive a monster if he built you a sanctuary? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and let us know which country you are watching from.